Hi, and welcome to part 2 of our hairless cat sculpt that we did in Nomad. I've exported this out of Nomad, and now I've imported it into Blender. It's a GLTF file, export for Nomad. If you pull that into Blender, you can see that it shows up with the lights intact as well as the vertex color. Now, this isn't an intro to Blender. This tutorial assumes you have some familiarity with Blender. But we're going to show how I set up my Nomad models to be rendered and some little advanced tips and tricks near the end. The first thing I do is I go to each piece of geo and I turn smooth shading on simply by right clicking and hit smooth shade. Over in the right, in our object properties, sometimes I'll go in and I'll turn on auto smooth. Sometimes that's necessary. I did that for the collar. Anything that has some crisp, sharp edges, you want to do that so those sharp edges come through as well. So right now I'm just going to each piece of geo, right click, hit shade smooth. Pretty simple as that. Again, if you're new to Blender, you probably need to watch some beginner Blender tutorials to really get familiar with the layout and setup. But if you have some working knowledge, this should seem like a fairly familiar workflow to you. All right, I think I'm about done here. Next, I'm going to turn on our rendered viewport mode and take a look at the lighting coming through. And you can see all these lights came in straight from Nomad, already set up for us. All right, I'm going to check some of my render settings, turn on ambient occlusion so those things look a little bit better. And next, I'm going to go to my world settings, and I'm going to add an HDRI map. So I'll just click on the color, look through my files, pick out an HDRI map that I've gotten from HDRI Haven. HDRI Haven has a lot of good free HDR maps. And I'm going to pull down the intensity. I like to have just a little bit of HDRI just for some ambience in the render. So pull that down. But mostly I'll rely on my 3-point lighting. So now I'm going to go to each of my lights and just kind of mess with the color a little bit more, bring up the intensity so their effect is a little bit more obvious. And I'll even name those to my key and my fill and my rim. You can see on the left I have my little hotkey readout enabled, so if you're not sure what I'm clicking on, you can see down there in the left hand corner. I'm going to add all my lights to a collection for easy organization. I like to keep my geo in a collection usually, my lights in a collection, things like that. Right now I'm playing with my color. Originally I had a warm fill light, but I switched that to a cool blue. And now I'm going to take my key light and make that more warm and intense. This is all just kind of to taste. Just kind of try a few different things and see what I like. I'm still kind of getting a feel for what I want my end composition to be. So right now I'm really liking almost like a sunlight hitting from the right side there. And just like we did in Nomad, my rim light that's in the back, I get that to where you can see it on an edge, and I crank the intensity just so you have this kind of glowing lit edge when looking from the front. So here you can see on the left side that rim light's really loud and clear. Next, I'll switch to my camera view, and I'll adjust my focal length. I usually like something a little bit more portrait friendly, like a 50 or 75. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and turn on camera to view in my viewport settings so I can navigate with the camera. And I like to set it up for a square format because I'll probably be posting this image to my Instagram. And if you haven't already, you can find a link to my Instagram right here. I'll post that in the video. It's also in the video notes too. right, now I'm going to start dialing in these materials a little bit better. I'm going to use the same material for all the skin stuff. It already has the vertex color plugged in, so I can make some tweaks, give it a name skin, and then apply that same material to the ears. And I'm increasing the roughness so he's not as shiny. A little trick that I like to use is usually on any sort of rubber or plastic or skin, I add some subsurface in there, and be sure and set that to random walk. Random walk subsurface has a much cooler look to it than the default Christensen Burley. So I'll crank up some subsurface, and we'll have to give it more of a reddish subsurface color. Later I might tweak this and kind of dial in the subsurface by connecting the vertex color and doing a multiply with it. But for now, this will work just fine. We'll add a red subsurface. For the eyes, I'm kind of playing around here. I definitely want to crank up the specular and pull down the roughness so they have a gloss to them. I put some metallicness to them to see if I can kind of colorize the specular highlights. And I'm not sure if I'll keep that. I'll continue messing with this as I go. In fact, I'm going to try just hooking up the vertex color into the specular. So really what I'm looking at here is I want that white specular highlight that was painted to really reflect in the eye. I'll give the eyes some subsurface color, just kind of trying some things, trying to figure out exactly the approach I want to take. So I'm going to give them maybe a purplish subsurface to them. I'll go ahead and pull back that metallic look. It starts to look a little too dark for the eyes. All right, so I'm going to try something here. Since I've painted white as the specular highlight, I'm going to try and get the eyes to where we're really just seeing actually, since I have black here in the irises, I'm going to limit that and multiply that in the specular so there's no specularity within the black, if that makes sense. So I just connected a color ramp up to the vertex color, made it black and white, and just kind of used it as a way to threshold out the specular highlight. I'm going to add a principled hair BSDF for the whiskers. Just make them kind of a yellowish white, kind of a cream color. And really, that'll end up looking pretty good once I get that set in. I'm going to go ahead and turn on cycles. That's the render I like to use for this stuff. When you first enable cycles, especially if you're using GPU compute, on 292, 293, it can sometimes take a while before cycles really enables. So I kind of cut out the waiting here. But once you wait, like it could take up to 5 minutes sometimes, but once you wait that out, come back, it'll switch on and off pretty well. I also went ahead and turned on the denoising for my viewport, set that to automatic. And once cycles enables, you can see that the hair shader shows up a lot better in the whiskers. I'm going to play with my camera placement and layout a little bit. I want to add a pretty shallow focus, so one of the things I like to do is add an empty, plane axis empty, and I'll name that focus, and then I'll set it kind of around the eyes or nose of our character, and then I'll highlight the camera and tell that to be our focus object. It's an easy way to kind of show interactively where we want to focus. So now I'll set my focus object to my empty, which I named focus, and I'll pull my f-stop way down. We'll try like 1.4 so we can get some shallow depth of field fall off. There's not a lot happening depth wise in this image, but that ear that's furthest from camera will have a nice little subtle blur to it. You can really see that subsurface scatter effect in the ears. It looks really nice once you turn on cycles, get all that going. So now I'm going to try some more advanced rendering stuff. I'm going to add some short fur. I'm going to do that by highlighting the skin, and then I'm going to add a particle hair system. And the hair system by default always looks a little bit crazy, especially depending on your scene scale. But it's not hard to dial in. So one of the things you'll want to do first is pull that hair length way back. So I think it's set to like 5 by default, but we want to pull it way down. Let's get something like 0.01. Now you see I have just tiny little hairs all over him. It's kind of what the effect I'm after here. It is a hairless cat, but we're giving him some peach fuzz. And I'll crank up the number of hairs. I really won't be using children hairs here because there's not going to be any clumping. The peach fuzz is just kind of individual hairs. All right, so I need to add a shader for my hair. So I'm going to add the shader, and this is on top of the skin shader. You have a skin shader, but you also have a hair shader. I'm going to set this to a hair BSDF, and we'll go again with kind of a creamy color, kind of like our whiskers were. And now I'll go back into my particle settings, and we will go and we'll set that material on the hair. So that's up under the render tab. I'll do it here in a second. Oh yeah, real quick, under timing, I can set random and crank that up, and that'll randomize the length of the hairs. And I may need to increase the length of the hairs a little bit, just so you can see that a little bit better. We'll try 0.02. And you'll see here I haven't quite set the material yet, so I need to go ahead and do that. That is under the render settings. Right here I set the skin. I'm going to switch that to M fuzz. That looks a lot nicer. But right now his hair is a little bit thick, so we need to go down to our hair shape tab, and we need to decrease our diameter. It's always set to default at 1, which is a little bit too much. Again, kind of depends on your scene scale. 0.1 is probably a little too thin. I don't know. It's kind of nice. You can see it's just kind of a subtle look, but we'll go ahead and increase it just a little bit. Let's try 0.3. All right. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. It's got some nice little peach fuzz on them. We'll make these hairs a little bit wider, just going into our hair shader and cranking that up. All right, and we'll go ahead and make it, let's do 0.2. 0.3 was a little thick for my taste. You know, a lot of these things are just kind of dialing things into taste, trying some different settings and seeing what you like. I'll go ahead and name this system, this particle system fuzz hair, and we need to apply it to the ears. So we'll select the ears and add that particle system, switch it to the fuzz hair. We need to go ahead and then add the shader that we had set up. I called it M fuzz. So we'll add that to the ears and then make sure it's selected here in the render tab, which it is. And so now you can see I've got some nice little short peach fuzz hairs on the ears. All right, we're getting really close here. Next up, I'm going to increase the metallic properties of the shader on the tag and get those nice and shiny. We'll probably need to increase the specular as well so they really shine, have a nice sheen to them. And then I'll take my collar, and we might take a look at maybe beveling the edge on this collar. So I'll just add a bevel modifier to our modifier stack and just decrease the amount, just so I have a nice subtle bevel to the hard edges on the collar. That looks pretty good there. Switch back to cycles, just make sure everything's looking nice. Okay, it's looking pretty good. I might just zoom in here so I can take a closer look at the face. I think I'd like to do a little bit more further refining on some of my shaders on the face. So I will split my view and then I'll switch to shader editor. So now I think I'm going to do a little bit more shader work on the eyes. I'll select them. And you can see here how I've thresholded out the irises. I'm going to do the same little trick, except I'm going to threshold out just the specular highlights that I have painted since they're painted white. So I'll plug that into the base color so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm going to move the thresholding over to where I only have the whites that are shown over black. And then I'll just take those whites and plug them straight into emissive. So that way they will be like really shiny highlights. It's kind of a cheat little trick for having some nice white highlights that are painted on. And then we'll just hook up the old base color back into it. I think that looks a lot better, having those big, bright, painted on highlights. Next, we'll take a closer look at the skin. I think I'd like to work in some darker kind of ambient occlusion areas in the skin just to provide a little bit more contrast. So to do that, I'm going to need to add a geometry info node. That's under input, geometry, and we can grab off the little node that says pointiness to get access to sort of an ambient occlusion sort of feature on our geometry. So here you can see I have that plugged in. It's a little confusing because I've got the subsurface color turned on, but I'm going to take this and I'm going to add a color ramp to it. And we'll just use this as an easy way to kind of play with getting some contrast in. You can see as I pull in that black, you can see those kind of ambient occluded areas get darker and darker. And I just want to work that up to where I have kind of a high contrast in that area. If I take it too far, you can see the whole object gets dark, and I don't quite want that. I just want those dark areas, especially like the crease under the lips and in the middle of the nose, getting those really dark. So that looks pretty good right there. And now I'm going to use a mix RGB node to basically multiply that together with the color. So I'll switch this to multiply instead of mix and crank that to 100% or a factor of 1. And then I'm going to plug that into our subsurface color. And then we'll hook our base color back up. Now, I don't want our subsurface color to just be white, so I need to go here in the color ramp and switch that white node to kind of a deep red or peach color. And that's looking pretty good. You'll notice now that I have a lot more contrast in those crevices of the character. I'm going to increase the specular a little bit. I think the last thing we need is to add some noise and just some little pores and bumps to the skin. So we'll do that by going in, adding a noise texture. I like to first hook this up to the base color so I can kind of see what I'm doing. You can't really see anything when I first plug it in. I need to make sure I have that plugged in to the right texture coordinates, so I'll add a texture coordinate node. And let's come out of the object and plug that in. Again, you still can't really see the noise. It's really just because our scale is too big. It's set to 5. So I need to change that value here. So we're going to try something smaller, or sorry, larger, because if I make it larger, it's kind of how often it's tiled, right? So the more it's tiled, the smaller the texture is. So I'm going to keep cranking this up until I get some really fine noise. Again, I'm going to be using this for kind of pores and bumps across the skin surface. So I want these bumps to be pretty tiny. Here I am at 111. We're getting closer. Dialing it in. 180. We'll try 200. That looks pretty good. So now we just need to connect that into a bump node. So we'll add a bump node in here. Plug this into the height value. And then plug the normal into our normal map. And we'll go ahead and disconnect this from the base color. Plug it into our normal map. And you will see little bumps across our surface. And that looks pretty good. Now I've got the denoising here, so the effect isn't like terribly obvious in some places because the denoising likes to jump in there and try to clean some of that up. But I can see enough of where this is going. It's a little bit too strong, so I'm going to pull it down to a 0.3 on my strength. And I think that's looking pretty good. So we'll need to hook our base color back up. And then I think we're going to try and render this. All right. Base color's back in. It's looking really good. All right, I'm going to zoom back out here so I can see the whole image to see if there's anything else that needs to be done. Make sure my camera's in position the way I like it. I think it's looking pretty good. So the next step is to go and start doing some renders, some final renders, and seeing how those look. So I'm going to go ahead and save. Don't forget to save early, save often. We'll go to render, render image. All right, and I'll speed this process up. The render really didn't take too long, but just for sake of brevity, we will speed up this video. You can see just how well those skin pores read on this final render. It looks really good. But I did notice after rendering this one that I forgot to turn on denoising on our final render. I only had it turned on the viewport. So be sure and go and turn it on in your rendering under the render tab under denoising. And I like to use the open image denoise. And, you know, we can pull our render samples down. They were at 128, but 64 should be just fine. And now, here I'm going to speed up the render. Again, it didn't take terribly long, just maybe a couple minutes, but for the sake of this video, we'll speed it up really fast. And this is about it. Really happy with the way this turned out. And I'll give a quick little pan across our final image. And I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know in the comments below. If you have any questions about this process, just feel free to ask. And if there's anything else you'd like to see me sculpt, I'll do that. Until then, like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Talk to you later.